They thought she was nothing, just another guard in dust-stained fatigues standing at the far edge of the base. A clipboard in her hand, a rifle slung too neatly at her side, a quiet figure under the crushing desert sun, not a fighter, not a leader, not even worth remembering, or so they believed. But one moment changed everything. When a truck rolled toward the gates and her sleeve slipped, revealing an insignia older than metals, tied to a legacy of sacrifice, the checkpoint fell silent, and the lieutenant who once dismissed her lowered his radio and raised his hand in salute. The desert sun pressed down on the outer checkpoint like a furnace. Sand hissed across the asphalt, sticking to sweat and stinging exposed skin. Heat shimmered above coils of razor wire, while convoys rattled in and out of the compound in endless procession. Nobody paid much attention to the guards stationed here. They weren't pilots flying sleek jets. They weren't officers with medals catching the light. They were just silhouettes at the gates, checking IDs, waving traffic through, standing still until their legs ached, and among them stood Alina Ward. Her uniform looked no different from the others. Dust-stained fatigues, sleeves rolled neatly, boots planted square on the concrete. Her rifle hung too perfectly slung at her side as if even gravity obeyed her discipline. She kept her posture rigid, her tone polite, clipped and firm, her eyes locked on every driver who approached, scanning with quiet precision. But to most who passed her, she was invisible. A clipboard soldier, one sergeant once muttered, the kind you post at a gate because they don't belong in a fight. Nobody knew her story. Nobody cared enough to ask, but Alina knew theirs. She noticed the tiny details, the nervous tapping of boots, the twitch of fingers gripping a wheel too tightly, the hurried glance exchanged between driver and passenger. Guard duty wasn't about standing still. It was about seeing everything, and Alina Ward saw more than most officers ever realized. The afternoon dragged on, heat rising in shimmering waves across the tarmac. Most guards wilted under the desert blaze, shifting restlessly in their boots. But Alina's eyes stayed sharp, fixed on the horizon. That's when she heard it, a truck engine. Louder than most. Gears grinding, protesting under strain, it rolled toward the checkpoint slower than the others. Its paint was mismatched, patches of fresh coat layered awkwardly over rust. Dust clung to the sides in strange streaks, as though it had taken rough back roads no supply convoy ever used. The driver's hands trembled faintly on the wheel. His gaze darted away when Alina's eyes locked on his. He handed over papers. They slid too quickly, edges smudged, stamps too crisp and clean, as though they had been rushed through a machine only hours before. "Where are you coming from?" Alina asked. His reply was quick. Too quick. Her instincts sharpened. Something wasn't right. She studied the tarp stretched tight over the truck's cargo bed. The straps were uneven, cinched down hastily in some places, slack in others. Shadows shifted oddly beneath it, shapes that didn't resemble supply crates at all. Nearby, a lieutenant sighed and glanced at his watch. "Clear them through, Ward," he said impatiently, barely looking up. But Alina didn't move. Her fingers pressed against the papers. Her gaze stayed locked on the driver. "No," she said flatly. The lieutenant frowned, irritation flashing. But something in her tone, unshaken, certain, made him hesitate. And then it happened. As she raised her hand to signal the truck aside, her sleeve slipped back. Ink flashed in the sunlight. Not a vanity design, not random lines. An insignia, a naval seal etched with precision, the kind once carried only by families tied to the Navy's history for generations. The lieutenant's breath caught. His radio hand faltered. He knew that seal. And so did others. The checkpoint fell silent. For months, soldiers had passed Alina Ward without thought. She was a background figure, a guard no one remembered once they were through the gate. But the tattoo on her arm, it was unmistakable. It wasn't just Navy, it was heritage. A mark reserved for families whose bloodlines had shaped the fleet for decades, admirals who had commanded warships, strategists who had written doctrine, heroes whose names were etched into stone, monuments across bases and academies. And now that seal lived, here, on the arm of a guard dismissed as clipboard. "Soldier." The lieutenant's posture straightened without meaning to. His hand lowered his radio slowly, almost reverently. Where did you get that?" he asked, voice quieter than before. Alina didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained locked on the driver. Then evenly she spoke. "My father carried it." and his father before him. Both bled for the Navy. Both served this base. The driver shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, sweat breaking across his temple. The lieutenant's irritation evaporated. Suddenly, the weight of the moment pressed on his chest. If Alina Ward was suspicious, then she had reason, and that reason mattered more than his impatience. "Clear the checkpoint," she ordered. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried command. Guards who had once ignored her now obeyed instantly, pulling barriers tighter, shifting positions, rifles lifting with sudden urgency. For the first time since the truck appeared, the checkpoint wasn't just following procedure. It was following her. Engines rumbled low, a predator's growl. The truck idled at the checkpoint, its driver's hands gripping the wheel too tightly. His gaze darted between the barrier and the guards tightening their line. "Step out of the vehicle," Alina said. Her tone was calm, final. The driver shook his head. Then, suddenly, his foot slammed the accelerator. The truck roared forward. Shouts erupted. Guards scattered, rifles rising, boots thundering against the pavement. The lieutenant fumbled with his radio, panic choking his words. But Alina was already moving. She slammed her palm against the emergency barrier control. Steel teeth erupted from the ground with a thunderous crash. The truck struck the barrier head-on, metal shrieking as its front axle shattered. The windshield burst, glass spraying outward. Tires shredded. The vehicle lurched to a violent halt. The tarp snapped loose, and the truth spilled out. Barrels, wires, bricks of military-grade explosives stacked in rows. Enough firepower to tear the base apart in seconds. Gasps echoed across the checkpoint. One soldier cursed under his breath. Another staggered back in horror. But Alina didn't step back. She stepped forward, her weapon rose, her stance solid, her voice sharp as steel. "Hold your fire. Nobody shoots unless I give the order." The chaos froze. Guards obeyed. Even the lieutenant's shaking hand stilled. Because in that moment, Alina Ward wasn't a gate guard, she was command. The wrecked truck hissed in the heat, smoke curling into the cloudless sky. The acrid stench of fuel clung to every breath. Alina stood at the center of it all. Dust-stained fatigues, weapon still raised, the naval seal visible on her arm like a brand of authority. Her breath was steady. Her gaze was unbroken. The lieutenant's radio slipped uselessly to his side. His chest heaved as he looked at her, not as a guard, but as the reason the base still stood. For months she had been invisible. Today she was undeniable. A private whispered, "Awed." She stopped it, another answered, voice trembling. "She saved us all." The words rippled outward, carrying truth. Alina lowered her weapon deliberately, calm, controlled. And then the lieutenant moved. Each step echoed on the concrete until he stood before her, his face pale, his eyes locked on hers. Then with slow certainty he raised his hand in a salute, crisp, certain, born not of rank but of respect. One by one the others followed. Rifles lowered, boots straightened. Hands rose, salutes rippled across the checkpoint, slicing through the smoke and dust, not for her badge. Not for regulation. For her, Alina Ward. The guard whose uniform hid not weakness but a legacy of sacrifice. The soldier who saw danger when no one else did. The quiet figure who became the shield of the entire base. And though official reports would later reduce it to a line in an incident file, the men and women who stood there that day would never forget. They would remember the dust, the heat, the smell of fuel, and the quiet woman whose truth humbled them all. If Alina's story struck you, remember this. True strength doesn't always shine with rank or glitter with medals. Sometimes it's carried quietly, in the hands of a guard, a painter, a worker no one notices. Heroes don't always wait for the spotlight. Sometimes they're already standing steady in the shadows. If you believe stories like hers deserve to be told, subscribe and share this, because somewhere out there someone needs to be reminded that courage can be silent, but it can change everything.